At dawn on November 24th, 1326, the city of Hereford was restless. The air was thick with excitement and anticipation, not for a festival or a knightly tournament, but for something far more exciting: the staged death of England's most hated man, Hugh Despenser. Thousands of people had been pouring in for days. Merchants quickly set up tents selling food and even macabre souvenirs. In the center, a huge three-tiered grandstand had been erected with one purpose only: to ensure everyone had the best view of the execution ground. And there, in a specially decorated royal enclosure, sat Queen Isabella, calmly sipping her wine, as if she were enjoying a play rather than a torture. This was not an execution. This was the great revenge of medieval England. The act began with a ritual humiliation. Hugh was dragged from his cell, completely naked. But nakedness was not enough. Every hair on his body was shaved from head to toe, leaving no trace of dignity. The crowd cheered with delight as the once powerful Chamberlain looked like a plucked chicken. Next came the body painting. Biblical verses about treachery and forbidden sins were written on his flesh in ink mixed with pig's blood. Judas on his forehead, the vile one along his spine. And then they placed on his head not a crown of thorns, but a crown of nettles. The plants were carefully chosen to cause immediate, searing pain. Hugh's scalp began to blister and swell, a torture that continued even before the main act began. Then came the parade. Hugh was tied upside down to a horse, facing the tail, an insult reserved for traitors. The procession wound through the streets where his victims awaited, hurling rotten vegetables and shouting curses. When they reached the execution ground, the cruelty was taken to a new level. Hugh was hung, but not to die. His executioners carefully counted his breaths, lowering him just before he suffocated, then resuscitating him with vinegar. The crowd counted along, cheering each time he was saved, only to be met with further pain. And then the most brutal torture began. The executioner advanced with a red-hot knife. Before thousands of eyes, he slowly castrated Hugh. Hugh's genitals were removed and thrown into a special iron basket, which burned to ashes before his eyes. The Chronicle recorded, he watched his manhood turn to dust while the crowd celebrated. But the nightmare was not over yet. Next came the disembowelment. Instead of quick cuts, the executioner made precise cuts in his abdomen, slowly pulling out his intestines while Hugh remained fully conscious. Even more horrifying, his intestines were burned while still attached to his body. He could feel the heat spreading through his body. During those 4 horrifying hours, a priest read out the charges: embezzlement, manipulation of the king, piracy, blasphemy. Each charge was punctuated by a new wave of pain. After 4 hours, the beheading was almost a relief. But even that was done with drama. Finally, his body was dismembered into 4 pieces. The crowd even voted to decide which part of the body would be sent to which city. The head went to London, the right arm to York, the legs to Northampton. Each piece of Hugh Despenser became a political statement, a bloody reminder displayed across the kingdom of the price of defying a queen and pushing a nation to the limits of endurance. Hugh Despenser had power, money, and the king's absolute favor. He had neutralized his rival lords. Now, there was only one force at court who could stand in his way: Queen Isabella of France. And Hugh made what history would later prove to be the most fatal mistake of his life. He did not just oppose Isabella politically. He decided to destroy her life, stripping her of everything that made her human. Picture this. You are the queen of one of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe. You have sired an heir, maintained a fragile alliance between England and France. You have dignity, wealth, an entourage, and most importantly, children. Then one day, your husband's closest aide decides that you are a threat that must be eliminated. Not by killing you, but by destroying you piece by piece. This was no ordinary court political intrigue. It was a personal war disguised as an administrative order. In September 1324, using the pretext of the conflict between England and France, Hugh struck. In a single day, he orchestrated the confiscation of all 28 fiefs belonging to Isabella. This was a huge fortune, the source of her power and independence. The queen's books recorded a bitter complaint. I am treated worse than a merchant's wife. But that was only the first shot. A few days later, Hugh ordered the arrest of Isabella's entire French entourage in night raids. Her personal physician, who had served her since childhood, was thrown into a dungeon on trumped-up charges. Even her confessor and her closest maids were banished. The queen burst into tears at court, the chronicler recorded, but no one dared to comfort her for fear of Despenser's wrath. Hugh had succeeded in isolating Isabella, cutting her off from all moral support, from all ties to her homeland. But the most vicious blow, the one that sowed the seeds of later terrible vengeance, was against her children. Hugh understood that the power of a medieval queen was tied to her role as mother to her heir. He took the royal children away from their mother. Prince John, 8, was placed in the care of Hugh's wife. Princess Eleanor, 6, was sent to the Despenser Manors. Isabella was allowed to visit her children only once a month, under the close supervision of Hugh's men. Every conversation was monitored. Can you imagine the pain? It wasn't just the loss of a child. It was the ultimate humiliation. Hugh was sending a clear message. You have no power here. You have no future here. Even your most sacred role, that of motherhood, is in my hands. Everything Hugh did was terrifyingly legal. Every seizure, every arrest had the royal seal. He wasn't breaking the law. He was weaponizing the law. It was during those long, lonely nights in her palace that a terrible change took place inside Isabella. Humiliation turned to rage. Pain turned to hatred. Tears dried up, giving way to a steely determination. Hugh Despenser made the mistake that many tyrants throughout history have made. He underestimated the endurance and willpower of a cornered man. He did not understand that he was not just destroying a woman. He was creating a monster. He did not know that the once fragile French princess carried the blood of the most ruthless kings. The deprivation of her children was the moment Isabella decided that Hugh would not just die. He would be destroyed, erased from the world in the most painful and humiliating way, so that the whole of England would remember the lesson of angering a queen. Destruction of the queen seemed like the height of his cruelty, but for Hugh Despenser, it was only the beginning. He was about to show England that his greed knew no bounds. And to do that, he did what no favorite in history had ever dared to do: become a pirate. Yes, you heard that right, a pirate. The year is 1321, when a coalition of lords finally succeeds in forcing King Edward II to temporarily exile the Despenser family. Most of the exiled nobles would have gone to France or Italy, lived quietly, and waited for their political opportunity. But Hugh was different. He saw this as a business opportunity. He acquired a ship and began raiding merchant ships in England's own channel. Imagine the madness. The king's right-hand man, who had once been the judge of the law, had become the greatest criminal on the sea. The chronicles recorded the shock of the entire kingdom. He who had judged others for theft had become the greatest thief. But this was not the act of a desperate man. It was a carefully calculated campaign of economic terrorism. Hugh used his own inside knowledge from his time at court. He knew the schedules of the ships, which ships carried valuable cargo, which merchants had supported his exile. It was a deliberate act of economic revenge. In just a few months, Hugh's pirate fleet had captured dozens of merchant ships, amassing a huge fortune. He had built a criminal empire at sea to finance his return. And when he returned, he was even more terrifying. Hugh had learned a crucial lesson during his time as a pirate. Outright theft was profitable, but legal theft was sustainable. He no longer needed a pirate ship. He had a much better weapon: the king's seal and a thoroughly rotten conscience. The period from 1322 to 1326 is known to historians as the Great Devour. Hugh carried out a campaign of looting on an industrial scale. His methods were sophisticated but brutal. He would accuse a landowner of treason or of fictitious debt. He would then use the king's power to temporarily confiscate that property for the crown, never to return it. A wealthy widow was thrown into a dungeon and tortured until she voluntarily signed over all her assets to Hugh. He didn't even spare his sister-in-law's rightful inheritance. He forged papers, threatened judges, and had soldiers occupy castles before their owners could react. He turned the justice system into a service for his personal vendetta and the national treasury into his personal ATM. Fear gripped the nobility. As the story of the Countess's tortured madness spread, the message was clear: to defy Hugh was to die. Many were forced to sign papers giving up their ancestral lands in exchange for their family safety. By 1326, Hugh Despenser had become the most powerful and hated man in England. He had made enemies of the lords. He had ruined the queen. He had plundered merchants and peasants alike. He thought himself invulnerable. But he had not realized that when you make everyone your enemy, you have nowhere to run. The stage was set for revenge, and the curtain was about to fall on his life. Our story begins in 1316, when a little-known knight named Hugh Despenser Younger was appointed to the post of royal chamberlain. Sounds boring, right? A mere administrative post. Wrong. The position made him the most powerful unelected official in England. To understand Hugh's power, imagine this in the modern world. If there was a single person who controlled every email, every text message, every phone call to the president, that person decided what the president would see, what he would hear, and who he would meet. That's exactly what Hugh achieved, but in medieval times. This was not just a managerial position. This was absolute power disguised as paperwork. And herein lies the crux of the matter. King Edward II, the ruler of England, was a man wholly unfit to be king. The chroniclers described him as more interested in rural affairs than in royal duties. In layman's terms, he would rather dig ditches and thatch roofs with peasants than sit on the throne and rule. He was weak-willed, disliked confrontation, and desperately needed moral support. Edward II was a perfect target for manipulation, and Hugh Despenser stepped in. He realized that by making himself indispensable to the king's daily activities, he could rule England effectively. Take a look at a typical day in the court of King Edward II after Hugh took power. Morning. Hugh arrived at the king's chambers before dawn. There was a pile of letters from lords, bishops, and foreign ambassadors. But Hugh didn't just sort them. He decided which letters the king would never see. A letter from an earl complaining about tax policy? Throw in the fire. A message from a bishop about church corruption? Hugh would take care of it personally. Afternoon. A long line of nobles waited to see the king. Some had traveled for weeks, spending a fortune to get to court. But Hugh controlled the door. One powerful lord had once waited 6 months for a 5-minute meeting. Why? Because Hugh had not liked the look on the lord's face during a previous meeting. The chronicles were specific about Hugh's long memory for the slightest insult. In the evenings, the king's council met. Traditionally, this was where the greatest minds of the kingdom gathered. But by 1320, Hugh had eliminated anyone who dared to question him. The king's council became Despenser's echo chamber. The financial control was astonishing. By 1322, father and son had diverted some 40% of the royal revenues into their personal accounts. One chronicler recorded, "Not a grant, not a pardon, not a single appointment was made without the Despenser family having a share." And here's the most terrifying part. Historians believe that King Edward II knew exactly what was going on, but he didn't care. One account records, "The king was delighted with Despenser's ruthless efficiency, calling him my dear and faithful Hugh, even as the nobles wept at his cruelty." By controlling the portal, Hugh had turned the entire British government into his personal playground. But controlling access was only the beginning of Hugh's plan. Because with the ear of the king, he decided to set his sights on destroying his greatest enemy, Queen Isabella. And that decision would eventually lead to one of the most spectacular revenges in history. Do you think cancel culture on social media is cruel? Do you think losing your job or being ostracized is the ultimate indignity? So let's rewind to 1326. Medieval England didn't just cancel Hugh Despenser. They turned his death into a 4-hour public torture festival, a spectacle so horrific it would make even the most violent movies look tame. Imagine being stripped naked and dragged through the streets while thousands of people, including children, cheer your death. Imagine the queen you betrayed sitting on a high platform, sipping wine while you are disemboweled before her eyes. This is not fiction. We have eyewitness accounts and court records. This is the story of how the king's corrupt favorite went from controlling an entire kingdom to having his body systematically mutilated in public. We're about to discover how one man's depravity led to the most creative and disturbing execution in history, and why both the most disturbing part is not Hugh Dispenser's execution. It's what happened to all those who participated in his destruction. The twist of fate did not stop with Hugh. Exactly 4 years later, Roger Mortimer, Isabella's lover and the man who had orchestrated Hugh's torture, stood on his own scaffold. The crowd cheered again, and Isabella, now imprisoned by her own son, King Edward III, could only watch helplessly as her lover suffered the same fate she had decreed for her enemy. The cycle of revenge has closed. Medieval history has proven a cruel truth. Extreme violence only breeds more violence. Those who use torture as a political tool eventually become victims of that same tool. The story of Hugh Dispenser reveals something disturbing about human nature, something that transcends the centuries. When we have the opportunity to destroy someone we truly hate, we don't just want them dead. We want them completely wiped out. Medieval England didn't have social media, but they did have something worse: the ability to turn revenge into a public celebration. The creativity they poured into Hugh's execution suggests that our modern forms of public humiliation are just sanitized versions of much more primitive desires. We have replaced physical torture with cyber attacks, traded public executions for the destruction of social media reputations. But the basic desire to completely destroy those who abuse power remains unchanged. So the next time you complain about political corruption or a scandal online, remember that at least you don't live in the Middle Ages, where justice is a 4-hour torture session. Be grateful that our worst politicians face impeachment, not impalement, and that the body parts on the city gates have been replaced by angry tweets. The dark history of medieval England makes our darkest moments seem like minor inconveniences. If this terrifying journey into medieval justice has left you in awe, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on more hidden history stories. Leave us a comment below. Which part of the story shocked you the most? Hugh's pirate phase or the 4-hour execution? Thanks for watching.